Welcome to today's event. We're very pleased to have such a great audience, both in person and online, to observe International Women's Day, which officially, as many of you know, happens every year on the 8th of March. My name is Megan Mannion, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. The Human Rights Center, also as many of you know, was founded in 1988 and was among one of the first dedicated human rights centers within a law school in the United States. A major thread of that history has always been in attention to the work of women human rights defenders, the work of the women's rights movement, and women's human rights more broadly. The center has advanced many projects, including housing influential networks of NGOs established early in the history of the UN movement for women's rights, as well as supported the work of many faculty, students, as well as my own, focused on the rights of women and girls, LGBTQ and gender diverse persons, and more. This year, for International Women's Day, we're very honored to co-host our event with the Consulate General of Canada to the United States in Minneapolis, in partnership with the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy. As you know, today's event is focused on the impact of conflict on women's rights. The devastating impact of conflict on women and women's rights, however, is not new, nor are they unknown. However, as we'll hear from our panelists today, we do see that despite these global political movements, such as the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, which we will discuss today, the impact of conflict on women often remains unaddressed, alongside a lack of recognition for their roles in preventing, responding to, and ending conflict altogether. We're very fortunate to hear from a series of speakers who will address these issues head on from their unique institutional vantage points, respective areas of expertise, as well as their personal experience. Before we get started, I do have a few logistics, given that this is a hybrid event. We received many, more than we can address today, excellent questions from attendees both online and in the in-person registration. Time permitting, we will aim to pose some of those questions to the panelists. Please do feel free to continue to use the Q&A online, and we'll have those questions on record for the recording that will be shared after the event. For those online, please note that we have both French and ASL interpretation. You can select the channel via the globe icon at the bottom of the right-hand side of your screen. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker for opening remarks, Beth Richardson, Consul General of Canada in Minneapolis. Beth Richardson was appointed to her current role in August 2023 and has worked with Global Affairs Canada since 1996. She has an impressive set of experiences working in the Eastern Europe and Eurasia Division, on the Afghanistan Task Force, and at the Canadian International Development Agency. Her assignments abroad include Seoul, London, Moscow, Miami, and Lithuania. Beth, thank you for co-hosting today's event and joining us for opening remarks. The podium is yours.
Alors, je viens de découvrir qu'on a un interprète en français. Je vais donner mon allocution seulement en français.
I'm joking, everyone. I'm trying to give the French interpreter a little bit of work. Okay. Let me know if you can't hear me correctly. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is a really important topic. It's important to Canada, and we're really pleased to be able to partner with the University of Minnesota on this. My name is Beth Richardson. I'm the Consul General of Canada in Minneapolis. And when we give people our spiel, they say, well, what the heck is that? So Canada and the United States have such a comprehensive, complex, multifaceted relationship that we actually have 12 diplomatic offices across the United States, in addition to our embassy in Washington. And our office here in Minneapolis covers 5 states: Minnesota, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. So along with the embassy in Washington and our 11 other consulates general, we work closely with our US partners to improve ties on both sides of the border. My colleague Donnie Fisher is here today, at the very, very back as well, who focuses really on Canada's global peace and security agenda. So first, I want to give my deepest thanks to Faculty Director Fionnuala Ní Olán, thank you, and Megan Mannion for helping make today possible. Je suis ici aujourd'hui pour partager ce que Canada fait dans le monde pour promouvoir, pour avancer la paix et la sécurité mondiale. So I'm here to talk a little bit about what Canada is doing in the world and why this is critical for us. And how could we possibly advance peace and security in the world without integrating the needs, interests, perspectives, and power of half the world's population? So I want to talk a little bit about why we're passionate about women, peace, and security, so much so that Canada appointed an ambassador for women, peace, and security 5 years ago today. The world is looking dark these days. It's funny, I've been talking to a lot of people about this and both how it's dark and how we feel about it and how we move forward to find solutions from here. Russian aggression in Ukraine has hit a 2-year mark, still ongoing. Hamas is perpetrating conflict-related sexual violence in Israel and in Gaza. And in a myriad of other places around the world, women face gender-based violence, conflict, and injustice. My last role before coming to this diplomatic assignment was working in Ottawa, managing Canada's relationships with the countries of the Horn of Africa. And in practice, a lot of my time before I came to Minneapolis was spent looking for solutions to the crisis in Sudan. While the experiences of Sudanese activists were heart-wrenching, the leadership of women peace builders was critical, absolutely critical and inspiring. The Women, Peace, and Security Agenda recognizes that conflict impacts men and women differently, and that women are powerful agents of change that cannot be ignored. So about 10 years ago, Canada developed an explicit feminist international assistance policy and feminist foreign policy. Why? Because investing in women, in education, in health, in entrepreneurship is the right thing to do. But it's more than that. It pays incredible dividends for development, for prosperity, and for peace. In fact, researchers have established a correlation between gender equality and peace in societies. The best predictor of a state's peacefulness is how well women are treated. And so the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda is a core element of our foreign policy, but it's also a core element of our domestic policy. Because women, peace, and security isn't just out there. It's not something that happens to someone else. It matters at home as well. And so we have a national action plan on women, peace, and security that focuses on our international efforts, but also what we need to do at home, particularly how it relates to the crises impacting Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And that means attending to the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and to continue the important work of truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada. So I do encourage you today to take a moment to think about how the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda impacts your life right here in Minneapolis or the Twin Cities right now, and what actions you can take in response. In 2024, it seems really quite incredible that we need to assert it, but women have the right to participate equally with men in decision-making at all levels, including on all matters of peace and security. And not only that, but there is a clear correlation between women's full and meaningful participation in peace and security processes and more just and sustainable peace. Canada is really committed to acting on this, not just talking about it, but acting on this. So I just wanted to flag 3 important initiatives that we have that help advance our contribution in the world. The first is the Women's Voice and Leadership Program. It's core funding for women's rights groups, for LGBTQI rights groups, about $50 million Canadian annually, that funds groups that seek to advance gender equality and women's empowerment, to help women organize, advocate, and play a greater role in national decision-making. The second, that's been ongoing for almost 7 years now, is the ELSI Initiative for Women in Peace Operations. This is something that has been spearheaded by Canada. The US is not a member yet, but hopefully soon, that helps countries develop greater capacity to appoint women law enforcement officials, women police officers to UN peace operations. So we work very closely with Zambia and Ghana in particular to do this. And in fact, this initiative has been so well received, the government of Zambia has asked us if we could please also start training their military, men and women, to understand that women have a role to play in bringing peace and ending conflict. And then the third one, as I mentioned before, Canada has an ambassador for women, peace and security. She advises Canadian ministers, so US would be the equivalent of US secretaries, cabinet secretaries, on the implementation of the plan at home and internationally, and works with women peace builders internationally to build stronger networks of support. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to listen to our speakers today, including Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, Natalka Simak, whom I've known for more than a decade now, I guess. All the panelists have direct experience in lifting women up, bringing light and power to their peace building work. So I thank you very much to all of the panel for taking the time to share your experiences with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. It's now really my pleasure to turn our attention to our panel. We have a number of distinguished panelists, and the first of which has already slightly been introduced by Beth. Our first panelist is Her Excellency Natalka Simak, Ambassador of Canada to Ukraine. Ambassador Simak was appointed to this role in August 2023 and has over 25 years of experience in the public and private sector. Ambassador Simak worked in the private sector before joining the Canadian government in 2007 and has served in senior posts in Health Canada, Global Affairs Canada, the National Defence, Indigenous Services and Public Services, and Procurement Canada. Ambassador Simak, we are thrilled to have you joining us online and look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours. Okay, great. So apologies for the technical difficulties, colleagues. We will turn to the panel discussion in the room. And so I'll move to my next introduction, which is one of our own, the Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center, Professor Fionnuala Ní Éluain. In addition to being the Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center, Professor Ní Éluain is the University Regents Professor, the Robina Chair in Law, Public Policy, and Society. Professor Ní Éluain is an elected member of the International Commission of Jurists and most recently served as UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Among many things, Professor Ní Éluain is an internationally recognized expert and scholar on women's rights, national security, and more. Professor Ní Éluain, thank you for your flexibility with the order of the panel. The floor is yours.
Always the best laid plans. And I just want to start by acknowledging and thanking both the Human Rights Center and my colleagues, Megan Mannion and Abby Nelson, who's gone to figure out some of our challenges, as well as the Consul General of Canada, Beth, and her team. And thanks also to the Center for Women, Gender and Public Policy for joining us today. So it's really a pleasure to be here and reflect on some of the challenges for women's rights and for the protection of women and girls in the context of complex conflicts. And more especially, I think, to focus on the relevance and operationalization of the women, peace and security agenda in those complex conflict situations. I think the conversation, as many have said, is profoundly relevant today as we see the ongoing and undulating effects of armed conflict on women's lives. In places as far apart as Kyiv to Gaza, from Juba to Kandahar, women and girls remain intensely vulnerable in multiple dimensions. And they remain vulnerable not just to violence, but to the structural and underlying inequalities that enable and sustain that violence and that allow for the marginalization and harm that women experience in multiple conflicts, which despite our many significant efforts over many, many decades, remains largely undisturbed, still a matter of huge and enormous work for the international community. So it's true, and I think we would all acknowledge that we've had much more attention in recent decades to the harms that women experience in armed conflict. And that's been matched by an equally positive attention to the roles that women can play in conflict ending and conflict transformation contexts. I know that very acutely myself from my own context of Northern Ireland, where the role that women actors played in the conflict at the grassroots level in particular, but also in the transformation of conflict was really essential and transformative. And I think in relation, as we think think about harms, it's worth acknowledging some of the really formal things that have happened in international law and international practice to focus attention on harms to women. They include, in particular, the recognition of multiple specific crimes under the rubric of international criminal law that address sexual violence in armed conflict. We've seen judicial proceedings in the conflict tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, and also from the ICC that have addressed legal responsibility for different actors for that violence. And we've also seen the launching and consolidation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda that we're talking about here today, launched in 2000 by the United Nations Security Council under what we might call the Mother Resolution of 1325. And those things coming together are really powerful, at least rhetorical and symbolic recognitions that there is a need to both address harm and to address women's positive role in security spaces. If we look particularly at the WPS agenda, the very laudable goal of WPS was to mainstream gender in all aspects of conflict prevention, conflict management, and conflict resolution. And that WPS agenda didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of decades of grassroots local work by women on disarmament, on peace building, on peacemaking. And ultimately, at the heart of the WPS agenda was a commitment by women to think about security differently, not to have security defined in the way it's been defined for centuries, largely by men, about the kinds of things that men are mostly afraid of and think about, but actually to transform our understanding of security so that we would move away from narrow-minded security thinking that has dominated international law for decades and move into a different understanding of what security was, but also how women would contribute to that kind of security. And that work is all the more important because we've seen a global backlash against women's rights, and we've seen the weaponization of the language of what we might call gender ideologies, is the terminology used by some states. And to do this work, the Security Council has had to also stand up and push back against that pushback against these developments of the last couple of decades. And the place where that's been most keenly felt is in sexual and reproductive rights. And it's really important to say that the Women, Peace and Security agenda has also, through the Security Council, articulated its support for women's reproductive rights in UN Security Council Resolution 1889 of 2009. And it's addressed sexual and reproductive health in a series of subsequent resolutions, 2106 of 2013, 2122 also of 2013. And I think one of the most important resolutions in this regard was the 2009 resolution, because it was an important moment to explicitly acknowledge that sexual and reproductive rights of women and girls in the context of women, peace and security have to be defended. And that includes not just a focus on sexual rights in the context of gender-based harm, but also that women's security, a holistic understanding of security, demands a holistic conception of reproductive and sexual rights for women and girls. Now, a really important part, as many of the room who know the WPS agenda will know, is that the first resolution, 1325, and these subsequent resolutions have stressed the importance of preventing sexual violence in conflict. And they've done that in two ways. One is to really firmly commit to accountability for sexual violence, and the other is political condemnation of sexual violence. And positively, that's been a really important thing. We've had centuries of almost no accountability and no recognition of the role that sexual and gender-based violence has played in armed conflict. What the attention of the WPS agenda on sexual violence has done is increase the scale, scope, and knowledge of the kinds of gender-based harms, particularly sexual harms, that women experience during war. But I would also say that it has come with some sizable tail. And that tale hasn't been uniformly good for women. One of that is that this focus on penetrative sexual violence above all other harms in conflict has displaced attention for women and girls from the totality of harms that they experience in conflict. And it has really undermined the attempts to address the compounded vulnerability of women and girls in multiple dimensions in conflict situations. It has also sometimes resulted in the commodification of sexual violence, and that commodification as a way of not looking at the totality of violence, but also an unwillingness to look at fundamental structures of inequality that drive violence in conflict and elsewhere. It's true, despite all of these developments, international criminal law developments, international courts, and the WPS agenda, women remain overwhelmingly and structurally vulnerable to violence in multiple forms in armed conflict. And I think one of the things that I'd like to stress as we think about particularly this space of violence, that we continue to and try to widen the aperture of harm that we have. And I would particularly stress the importance of focusing on the multiple destructive forms of violence that women experience. And one in particular I want to highlight today is obstetric violence and maternal harms in armed conflict. One of the most powerful illustrations of the scale and depth of maternal and obstetric harm is the current conflict in Gaza. What we see there is with over 600 military attacks on hospital and medical facilities, there is no functional healthcare system in Gaza. And we in particular see an acute crisis of harm to pregnant, nursing, postpartum women and women with young, vulnerable babies and children. Palestinian women are probably the exemplar of the ways in which we need to widen our aperture to understand the totality of harm that exists in a conflict space, to ensure that the focus of WPS is as wide as it should be to catch the totalities of harm and not to exclude our gaze to sort of particular and specific forms of violence without seeing the picture as a whole. The second thing I want to say about the stressor on the WPS agenda is the fact that despite all of these improvements, criminal law improvements, Security Council attention, women and girls largely remain excluded from peace agreements and peace processes across the world. People often use the example of Ireland as the best case scenario, but it turns out that actually the women who shoved their way, and they literally had to shove their way into the room to get into that peace process, faced extraordinary barriers to do so and had spent 30 years fighting what one of them called the armed patriarchy in our jurisdictions before they could get themselves what was ultimately a small seat at the table. When women are included, they're often included late. They're usually an afterthought. Oh, we suddenly realized that everybody at the top of the room was a man and there were no women present. And it's also true that when women get to the tables, their presence isn't indicative of influence on the outcomes. They often end up sitting at the very margins at the table where the big decisions, as they're called, on disarmament, on the political frameworks are left to the men to decide. And so it's also true that even if you're there, you may not always be there with influence. And it's also true that some of the women who get to the table are fundamentally not committed to representing women's interests at the table. And that doesn't mean that every woman at a negotiation table is a representative of her sex. We should be able to be at the point where women get to show up for all kinds of reasons. But it's also clear that if we don't have women at the table, the outcomes of these processes look markedly different. We need only speak to the women of Afghanistan about their exclusion from the Doha process to understand what it means to fix a deal without women at the table. So those are some of the challenges we face. But the bigger challenges I think we face on this somewhat belated International Women's Day is that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is facing fundamental challenge. There's the argument, I think, felt by many women on the ground in some of the places I've talked about, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza, that this agenda has just basically failed to deliver for women on the ground. Security Council member states like to stand up on the anniversary and give great speeches. But if you're a woman on the ground in a conflict zone, the WPS agenda may not in fact mean very much to you at all. The second criticism, of course, is related to the first, that for states it can serve interest to have the agenda named, but the hard work of delivering agendas often requires making choices that actually sacrifice particular things that you've clung to for many, many decades. And it's also clear that often the agenda just isn't applied where it should be. And I'll use my own example of Northern Ireland. After the Good Friday Peace Agreement, the United Kingdom government decided that Northern Ireland was not a conflict, and therefore that the WPS agenda did not apply to the post-conflict site of Northern Ireland. So when states can erase it out, it's very difficult for the women who've spent decades on the ground trying to implement the principles of what we might call the WPS agenda. Let me close by just making a couple of final remarks about some things I learned as UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism after 6.5 years. This is a space which is actually highly relevant to the WPS agenda, because one of the things that's happening globally is that traditional conflict spaces are being overtaken and colonized by the counterterrorism or national security space. And so the places where we thought the traditional norms of international humanitarian law would apply are increasingly spaces where states say they don't have conflicts, they have terrorism problems. And the result of this is that it's left women, specifically civil society actors, vulnerable to the excesses of executive power use that accompany counterterrorism practice across the globe. With Megan last year, we led a global study on the impact of counterterrorism measures on civil society and civic space. And from that, we produced something called the Playbook of Counterterrorism in the global study. And one of the playbooks is the securitization that's shaping civil society and countries across the globe. And when we talk about civil society, we actually should really say women, because in most countries, because of the absence of capacity to enter into public political space, civil society is predominantly gendered female. So when you attack and undermine and securitize civil society, you're attacking, undermining, and excluding women and girls. Perhaps the best known example of some of the extremity of that is the example of Loujain al-Houthi. She's a very well-known woman who led the movement in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the right to drive a car, which again, classic feminist move, you'd like to drive a car. She was charged with terrorism and convicted in a terrorism court for her activities of organizing and arguing for the right to participate in public space. And so we've seen women civil society actors being at the core of the targeting of civil society in many places around the world. But that doesn't mean that counterterrorism spaces are not learning from other spaces. There's plenty of women sitting in counterterrorism spaces. It's the old trick of adding women and stirring, just throw a couple of women into the soup and see what it feels like afterwards. And so one of the things we have to be really careful of, whether it's the WPS agenda or the increasing prevalence of the counterterrorism agenda, is that women are being used and commodified for the purposes of not rethinking security and not making us safer, but in fact undermining some of the fundamental tenets that drive liberal, open, and equal societies. So what do we have to do? 3 quick things I think we have to do. If WPS is to survive and be meaningful, it has to apply in real time equally to all women equally in all conflicts. WPS won't survive if it's seen as a pick and choose agenda, an a la carte menu that states can choose for some places, but not for others, for some women, but not for others. WPS also has to be a holistic agenda, not just an agenda that names one set of harms, but it has to be an agenda that is committed to the holistic experience of women, all women in conflict zones. Secondly, women's equality has to be at the heart of all the global work we do, whether it's at the Security Council, the European Union, the Inter-American spaces, or other informal spaces that we've seen emerged. If we want to make women's lives better, then equality has to be at the heart of the work. And finally, conflict mediation and resolution, whether it's in Afghanistan or Ukraine or Gaza, has to put women at the center, not just as an afterthought when the contours of the deal are made by the male elites. And as I said, what we brutally learned in Afghanistan is that when we leave women out, we end up with what appears to be gender apartheid. So thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Nayland. I think we'll be brave and try again to go online. I've been told by colleagues that Ambassador, we have you back. It's my pleasure to give you the floor for your remarks.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, good. Sorry about that, especially if I was speaking over the other speaker. I feel terrible about that. I did have a presentation, just a couple of images to help guide through the conversation. But let me begin by saying, so just on the first slide, it's an honor to be here with this panel. I will be speaking very much from the perspective of my experience here in Ukraine. So I've been here since August as an ambassador, but I have been posted to Ukraine previously 10 years ago. And I also worked on Ukraine when I was part of the Stabilization and Reconstruction Task Force when the war began 10 years ago. So I'll be speaking more from the perspective of seeing the change over the time. So 3 points to make. The role and participation of women in Ukraine has evolved with the Revolution of Dignity and the 10-year war. Sorry, still first slide. Importantly, this includes moving away from seeing women as only the victims of the war and to see them as active participants in defending their countries and communities. Point 2, regardless, there's still an impulse to reinforce more traditional roles and power structures between men and women in Ukraine in preparation for post-war and the return of soldiers. 3, countries like Canada must continue to engage with Ukraine in its defense and stabilization activities by supporting women in organizations, that includes governments and civil society, that are reinforcing the active participation and leadership of women. So next slide. The war has complicated and enriched women's roles in Ukraine. So all the hardships, I would say, of raising the families, the majority of that really does fall predominantly to the role of women before the war, and it's only intensified with the war. When the displacement began 10 years ago, so you saw people starting to move from occupied areas, Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk. So you had intense sort of repositioning of people to other parts of Ukraine and elsewhere, and that only intensified after. So as of May 2023, more than 8 million people have left. 5 million Ukrainians are now estimated to be internally displaced. Many of those have had to move multiple times as the war has changed it. And of course, the majority of those being displaced are women and children. Next slide. Women have been active in war and in resistance over the last 10 years. They've organized the protests, they participated in diplomacy, they act as frontline healthcare workers and humanitarian workers. Women's grassroots organizations are key in distributing humanitarian aid, hygiene products, emergency birth control. They fundraise for drones, they weave camouflage for soldiers, they make Molotov cocktails. Women are involved in defense manufacturing and are represented in high managerial positions. And recently, you see an increase of women on supervisory boards and CEO positions, including the defense industry. And while the Ukrainian armed forces consist mainly of men, women have also participated and do continue to participate in combat roles from the beginning. However, only in 2018 were women technically allowed to hold combat positions. But they face far more institutional and cultural challenges. Things like their uniforms weren't appropriate. They had faced far more discrimination and explicit sexual harassment. And yeah, I'll speak to that later. Most women have joined the armed forces that who did join were also persuaded to join as volunteers rather than as through the main armed forces, which means that they do not have the same access to the benefits of being in the armed forces. Next slide. But over the years, the image of the Ukrainian woman has changed. I've seen it myself, as well as specifically Ukrainian women soldiers. And I'm putting up this image of Oksana Rubanyak, who is a 21-year-old platoon commander. This was the issue for Vogue in the spring. She joined when she was 19 years old as a volunteer, and she became the first female machine gunner, I believe, and was the only woman on her platoon. She fought in Bakhmut, which you remember was very violent. She was injured in March 2023, and by August she returned back to the front. And she is evidence of Ukraine now taking real efforts of rebranding a more gendered mobilization narrative and providing a little bit more space to women soldiers in the armed forces, and just taking a much more positive and space in that domain. Next slide. But this change is taking 10 years. And many women activists who participated in the Euromaidan and the women's Sotnia volunteered in the Eastern Front, but it was not easy. They described themselves as invisible and faced harsh discrimination. According to sociologist study Tamara Marcinyuk on women's participation in the Donbas War, that was metaphorically named the Invisible Battalion, the study found that women soldiers were not allowed to hold important positions in the army. They worked in the worst conditions, and they faced many obstacles by the male leadership. The issues included not just the uniforms. There's no uniforms or equipment that were appropriate for women, but they lacked proper gynecological care. And they were not provided reintegration support in the same way. And in fact, many of the women experienced that social services had tried even taking away their children while they were on the combat zone. But much has changed, but not everywhere. Next slide. By the time of the full-scale invasion in 2022, women joined in much greater numbers and were much more determined to fight for their positions there. So there are now approximately 65,000 women who have served. That's a 30% increase since the war began. 45,000 of them are military personnel, the rest civilians, and approximately 4,000 in combat positions. These include combat medics, gunners, snipers, commanders of tank units and artillery batteries. There's at least one co-pilot, and she dreams to be the first Ukrainian combat helicopter pilot. So it's moving, you're seeing a real change in that movement. Next slide. Largely due to advocacy projects such as the Invisible Battalion, Ukraine has seen the change in behavior and legislations. I won't speak too much on that because much of this is due to the Ukrainian Women's Congress and the Equal Opportunity Caucus in the Parliament of Ukraine, who have championed a number of initiatives to advocate for equal opportunities serving in the military. They passed a new legislation to allow women officers to serve, but there's another speaker who I hope will be speaking to this far more. By 2022, women made up approximately 22% of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is a higher percentage than most NATO countries in the military forces. Next slide. We're also seeing that societal attitudes towards women in combat is changing. So this is an NDI, National Democratic Institute polling that was taken in December, and it shows a change. So first you see there's been a significant change in increased awareness and acceptance of the changing role of women in Ukrainian society. Second, that this contributes to Ukraine's military capabilities, and that this contributes to Ukraine's military successes. And three, that women should have the same opportunities as men to pursue a career in the military if they wish to do so. Next slide. But there are still some serious challenges, especially with mental health crisis that's being experienced in Ukraine right now. Sexual and gender-based violence has increased dramatically by 92% since 2022. And although Ukraine's legislation has laid a foundation for a national system of gender-based violence, its implementation at the local level has still a long way to go. Canada is contributing in this effort. We have supporting various complex systems of SGBV response, including more robust coordination mechanisms, as well as mobile units to really reach some of the hardest hit areas. Next slide. I think that Ukraine's armed forces is now actually becoming a leader in the world. Ukraine has adapted its national action plan on women, peace, and security, and I feel it's quite sophisticated as it's evolving. It now outlines how the conflict has amplified new roles between men and women due to high rates of unemployment. There's an increase of gender-based poverty, marginalization of labor markets, displacement of population, lack of access to healthcare, and an increased risk, unfortunately, of human trafficking. In March 2023, the concept developing women's organizations for defense has emerged, and there's now much more support in NGOs for women in defense, for example. I don't know if you can hear me. Hope it's okay. All right. And then the last slide, we'll go to the next slide. I stop here to on the slide for Olena Bizolarska and her quote that every woman in the military has her own story, even several, about how she was not allowed somewhere because she's a woman and has faced severe discrimination. And that's just to say that despite all of the progress, we don't want to lose sight of there's still so much to be done in Ukraine. But as I said, since I've been here in the last 6 months, I've seen and I spoke at the launch of the NGO of Women in Defense. I have visited some of these mobile units that are serving and helping women and families who are facing domestic violence, and particularly those directly affected by the war. And I visited designers who are looking to improve on various equipment, especially to make sure that they're adaptable to face for smaller soldiers and including women. So with that, I just wanted to say that the innovations are fantastic. Ukrainian women are leading a lot of these changes, and they're making a real difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm very glad we could get you connected to provide those remarks, and very grateful you're able to join us virtually. So switching up the panel a little bit, we'll move to our next speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Irina Dubrovich, who's a civil society leader and advocate for gender equality and democracy. She is a strategy director of the Ukrainian Women's Congress, a nonprofit organization. In this role, she collaborates with national and international partners on research and advocacy related to gender and public policy, and on women's rights and leadership in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine. Previously, she served as a government relations advisor with the Open Ukraine Foundation and as executive assistant to the Prime Minister. She is here with us in Minnesota as an International Humphrey Fellow. Irina, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my honor to be a part of this distinguished panel. And I would like to thank the Human Rights Center, the Consulate General of Canada in Minneapolis, as well as to the Center of Women, Gender, and Public Policy for organizing this important conference. And I also would want to pass special appreciation to the Embassy of Canada in Ukraine. For constant and unwavering support to the Ukrainian women leaders and women's organizations, especially in time of the large-scale war. Today is the 745th day of the large-scale war that has started 10 years ago, back in March 2014, when Russia has illegally occupied Crimea and invaded east of Ukraine. Today, approximately 65,000 of Ukrainian women serve in the armed forces of Ukraine, and 5,000 of them are currently executing the combat tasks on the battlefields. Today, Ukraine remains the only country in the world that back in April 2016 has adopted the UN Resolution 1325, being in the state of war. Moreover, as mentioned by the ambassador, in December 2022, Ukrainian government has reviewed and adjusted the National Action Plan for Implementation 1325 resolution due to the reality of the war. These are only few facts from many that I provide you like some context. However, in my remarks, I would prefer to lean on my personal experience. That would be more honest. I arrived in Minneapolis in August last year as an international fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. The fellowship became for me the opportunity to expand my knowledge in public policy, strategy development, and human rights advocacy. But also, this fellowship gave me a chance to reflect my experience that I have gone through back home and to notice in myself several identities that define my perspective on what the Ukrainian women's movement is experiencing right now. I'm the women's rights activist. This identity unites me with the Ukrainian women's movement that is acting in sustainable and efficient way facing the challenges of war. The leadership of women activists during this time is impressive. As demonstrated by the Association of Women Lawyers in their work with the victims of the war crimes and further advising the International Criminal Court in Geneva on improving their procedures based on the realities of the war in Ukraine. As demonstrated by the Business Association of Rural Women, that back in March 2022 evacuated from the front lines to the rears dozens of Ukrainian agriculture enterprises running by women and supported them with a new start of their businesses in safer environment. As demonstrated by women's veterans movement that supports women on the front lines with equipment and medical supplies, but also is advising the government on developing national veterans policy. I'm not facing the enemy as women on front lines are, like mentioned by the women soldiers, Olena Bilozerska or Oksana Rubanyak mentioned by the ambassador. I'm not facing Russian soldiers as women leaders in occupation are facing in their efforts to provide the community with more chances to survive. I'm facing different audiences in many countries in the world and share with them the stories about us. Provide them with the facts on how Ukrainian women lead their communities during the war and advocate for Ukraine being kept on the international agenda. My other identity is being a woman whose civilian husband came to the war to defend our country from the enemy. That identity unites me with those women who remain in the rear, either experiencing the war in Ukraine or contributing to the victory from abroad. While under enormous security threats, the amount of unpaid domestic work has substantially grown. And commitments for providing care to kids and elder family members have doubled or even tripled. Ukrainian women remain active and lead. In providing ammunition to the front lines, for example, like Maria Berlinska, who runs the Center for Supporting Air Intelligence and became the most efficient advocate for equipping Ukrainian soldiers with the drones. In humanitarian work, like Natalia Chermoshentseva, who runs the initiative Dignity and for 2 years provides first aid and humanitarian support to the people in occupation in South Ukraine. Or in making business more socially responsible, like Yana Goncharenko, who has initiated and developed the internal veterans policy for the biggest media company in Ukraine and made this internal policy public and open for other big and medium businesses. A few more facts confirm the extraordinary role of women in the rear. As reported by UN Women, 70% of Ukrainian women have volunteered to support their communities to withstand the challenges of the war. As reported by our Ministry of Economy, 52% of newly established small and medium businesses during the large-scale war are running by women. And as stated by the research, in the research by the Ukrainian Women's Congress, 62% of Ukrainian women who are currently abroad are ready to be back home and to contribute their knowledge and skills to countries' rebuilding and recovery. I arrived to Minneapolis with my, that time, 4-year-old son. Being a single caregiver to my child, not by decision, but because of the war, became one more identity of mine. And from that perspective, I'm first and foremost reflecting about saving Ukrainian children in time when Russia is conducting genocide against our nation. Both by securing for the kids safe environment to live, to grow, and to be educated, but also by ensuring for women their reproductive rights. In case of Ukraine, the legislative work has been already started in order to provide assisted reproductive technologies, in particular, post-mortem reproduction, with the possibility of storing and using biomaterials after death of the parent at the front line. The war brings the risk of getting back to the patriarchal social models, even though the country for decades has demonstrated impressive progress in gender equality, like Ukraine did, by allowing women to serve on officer positions in the army, by implementing quotas at the elections, or by canceling still Soviet labor legislation with abandoned professions for women. However, and especially in societies that are working hard on ensuring women's rights, the war provides new opportunities for women to act and to make difference in the most challenging times. While still fighting up to winning this war, and in view of preparing to winning peace, it is important to make sure that women will take the seat at the table where all the decisions will be taken, both during the war and in rebuilding Ukraine after. I will end my reflection with a quotation from the book of a Ukrainian writer, and now he is a soldier. His name is Alexander Mekhet. I want to forget it all. I want to never forget it. What is happening in Ukraine influences the developments in the whole world. The way Ukrainian women's movement is contributing to winning this war is outstanding. That is about irreversible change every Ukrainian woman has gone through and will never forget. This experience should become a part of global political and expert discussion, should be incorporated into international policies, including those developing in line with upcoming NATO summit in Washington, D.C. this summer. And this reflected experience should bring a real change in improving the stand of women in many countries, especially those experiencing conflicts and wars. Without women in the rear and on the front lines. Ukraine would never withstand the aggression so strong and for so many years. With women's commitment and leadership, Ukraine is still standing as an independent state, defending itself from the enemy. With women's meaningful participation, Ukraine will win this war and will further build sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. And I think we're particularly grateful for your willingness to share your personal experience. So our final speaker is also online, Trang Hong. Trang Hong is also a Fulbright, International Fulbright, or Humphrey Fellow, excuse me, and a development practitioner with more than a decade of experience working with civil society in Vietnam. Trang currently serves as a program officer with Oxfam Vietnam, where she works to empower women in marginalized communities to claim their rights and provide independent scrutiny of the government. She also coordinates the Fair Finance Vietnam Coalition, which works to improve financial options for local communities. Trang, welcome. Thank you for joining us all the way from CSW in New York. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here at this event, even like in virtually. And it is so much meaningful event for me, and with my personal perspective to talk about women, war, and peace building. I was born in 1986, so 10 years after the war ended. So the war here, my meaning is that it can be American war, as the people in Vietnam, the Vietnamese citizen often call, or Vietnam war, that when I came here, a lot of the US citizens talked to me about that. So sharing the experience about Vietnam War or American War is not my experience directly about in the war, but it's more about from what I learned in my educations, during my education, during my traveling around the country, my country, Vietnam, also from my father's as a veteran and his friends, including the woman veteran. And I think like during the American and Vietnam War, so the Vietnamese woman during the war is having the different roles and responsibility in three settings: in economic production, in family, and in the battlefield. So in economic production, the woman undertook the many work and participate in the employment and in factory and work in startup men during because men most of the time joining the battlefield. And in family, women also take care of the family, take care of the home, take care of the old age person, take care of the children. And on the battlefield, women become the warriors. And the image of a heroic Vietnamese woman at war as a warrior is not something totally new to me, because if you look back more in the history from Chinese, from the war against Chinese empires, against French colonial, we have a lot of examples and roles of the women like Hai Ba Chung or Ba Chiu as a warrior during the war. And during the Vietnam War or American War, we have Madame Nguyen Thi Duc. She was the first female general in the war. And after that, she was the first female vice president of Vietnam after the war ended. And also, like when the war ends, and during the peace negotiation and peace building process in 1972, uh, I I I I learned about Madame Nguyễn Thị Bình was the only one woman who signed in the Paris Peace Accords. And also I learned about Madame Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh, who attended in the peace negotiation as an interpreter, but also as a diplomat. And after that, both Madame Nguyễn Thị Bình and Madame Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh becomes a diplomat and the government leaders after the war. During prepare my remark, and so I use the ChatGPT to ask about like name who involved in the peace process in the Vietnam War, and the name of Madame Nguyễn Thị Bình was not appear on that. And I was like, oh my God, why, what happened? Why the woman as a leaders and very leading the process of negotiation was not mentioned in the AI or any like search machine on that. So I think it's also like the fact that we can do at the moment and in the modern time. And more about after the war, women also like contribute a lot in the economic growth of Vietnam and also participate in the employment economic sectors and also in the work. However, at the moment, we also have some challenge in terms of leadership in women, both in political leadership and also at the same time in management in private sectors. Despite we have like 30% of women labor in the employment, but only like nearly 20% at the manager positions. And we are also, I can see that women also still have the burden work as a care work. And women now have more time to do the care work at the house, more than men in Vietnam. So it is my reflection here is that we have the history of women as leaders during the war and during the time of the peace negotiation. But it doesn't mean that it can be led to the leadership of the women in modern time and after the war peace. And we also have more things to do with the leadership in political, in economic sphere for women. And at the moment, Vietnam also has the national action plan on WPS. And we also have the women in the peace building force and joining the UN peacekeeping operations. And it is a good progress in Vietnam, but also we have the challenging, and then we keep on working on that, because I think like working on gender and working on women injustice is an ongoing process. And yeah, and then as my work, I think that it is the thing like for me, I would love to see like more women in leadership position. And I also love to see more feminist leader in peace and conflict resolutions. And it can be like the image of the woman can be like broadened in many media and in many AI and in recent search engine that we can see women with many role and different role and important role in our world. Thank you very much. It's Anne from my side.
Thank you, Trang. Thanks for joining us while you're traveling for CSW. Really interesting to hear your remarks and also to reflect on the the various histories that have been recounted by panelists. And I wonder how AI will tell those stories as well. I think with the privilege of being the moderator and our short time, I am going to limit our Q&A session. We had a number of really interesting questions, both posed online, but also in the pre-registration forms. But I think given the expertise we have in the room, I'd like to pose at least one question. And I'll leave it open to all of the panelists. One of the most interesting questions we had was actually quite forward-looking, really highlighting the sort of longevity of the WPS agenda. So as many know, the WPS agenda will turn 25 years old next year. An anniversary that I know the international community is both anticipating positively, but also with some trepidation as the armed conflicts, including those mentioned here today, continue. So I would love to hear, as one of the attendees posed to the panelists, any priorities you think the UN, particularly the Secretary General, should highlight and prioritize as that 25th anniversary comes up next year. Does anyone want to jump on that first? We'll see if the ambassador is still with us. Perhaps I can go to you, Professor Nayland, first.
I'll be quick because I know we've kept people past our allotted time. I would say that we have to move from rhetoric to action. And I think that we do not need more resolutions. What we need is the implementation of the resolutions we have. And we need those resolutions to be implemented non-selectively. And so I think one of the dangers for the WPS agenda is fatigue and irrelevance. And people won't be fatigued if the agenda is live and vibrant and implemented, and it won't be irrelevant if it's implemented in all of the conflicts where it's needed. So I would say, looking forward, we need no new resolutions until we've implemented the resolutions we have.
Thank you, Professor Nayland. Irina, over to you.
Yes, let me follow what Professor Fionnuala just said. I fully support that we need to act, but as I have also mentioned in my remarks, we need to incorporate the experience of women who have experienced the conflicts in different countries. From my side, this experience from women in Ukraine, but most important here is also to reflect very carefully on this experience. Because what we see in Ukraine is that women lead. They make huge difference in their communities, but they very often do not understand their leadership. And all the action that can be advised to the UN what to do is like to train or to make some sort of actions for women who experience the conflict to like reflect about this experience, then to talk about this experience internationally. And if anybody in the international community has the space and the platform for women who experience the conflict to talk there, it will be the great opportunity. And then again, to act based on this new experience and new realities of the world we have right now.
Thank you, Irina. I'm just checking online. Trang, would you like to come in on this question?
I have very 2 points to add. Implementation and implementations. So in terms of implementation, I will call for the involvement of more and more civil society organizations, especially women-led civil society organization, to be involved in the implementation of the WPS, and also considering the need of the women, especially the reproductive and sexual health and the menstrual hygiene is very necessary in humanitarian assistance for women and for girls. And at the same time, the second point, I think that it is more implementation with the feminist leaders, and considering gender is the broad term, including LGBTQ groups and other groups, with the needs and then with the leaders. So it's not only like participant as the participant, it will be the leaders and leading the decision-making process. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Trang. We do have the ambassador with us, so I'm just going to pause for a moment. Ambassador Simak, if you'd like to come in on this question.
I thought the answers were excellent and on point. I think one of the things that I was trying to relay in what I've seen, and I'm not an expert in this area and I'm learning much from all the other panelists, but it's this women are leading and we see the difference there. So I think if there are more studies to show that, I think is probably, I think that's going to make sort of to convince some of the governments to have women participate more actively will be very convincing. Because I agree that more resolutions is maybe not the right time for that, but having more evidence and being creative of how we display that evidence or share that evidence in creative ways, maybe even, I know this, you see that in articles, but perhaps even in fine art or in movies. I think that will make a bigger impact on changing attitudes and behavior and recognition that women do play leadership roles. They are active. It's just making sure that that space isn't snuffed out during a war time, because that I think is what the danger is. And that is what I was trying to relay in my speaking, is that when there's a war, it seems that that's when the spaces are taken up by men and not enough room are made for women, even though they are key to leadership at the community level, the national level, in peacetime and in wartime.
Thank you, Ambassador. Beth, over to you if you'd like. Okay. So we'll stop there. Thank you everyone in the room for bearing with us as we go over. We still have a number of colleagues online who are bearing with us. We have closing remarks from our co-sponsor. Professor Christina Ewig is a professor of public affairs and faculty director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. She's currently working on a project that looks at whether electing more women and Indigenous peoples to political office in Latin America changes policy agendas to be more inclusive. She has also published widely on gender, race, and Latin America social policy. Professor Ewig, thank you for joining us and for co-sponsoring. The podium is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Wasn't this a wonderful panel? A rich array of scholarly voices, voices coming from experience that are giving us a glimpse of the WPS agenda over time, including before the WPS agenda was in place. So as Megan said, I'm Christina Ewig, Professor of Public Affairs, Director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy, which was, I learned today, founded just a few years before the Human Rights Center, because I didn't know what year the Human Rights Center was founded. So the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy has been around since 1985. And some of our earliest work was in collaboration with the Human Rights Center. And this is an instance in which we continue to have that collaboration. We've collaborated on women and UN instruments for a very long time. And being here and part of this agenda on women, peace, and security continues that relationship. Women, peace, and security is an integral part of gender and public policy. When you think about the WPS agenda, it's a major advance in international security policy, which is the hardest nut to crack when it comes to the degree to which this area of policy has been male dominated. Right. So the ability for WPS to bring women, to bring the concept of gender equality into the heart of the UN's security apparatus with the Security Council is enormous. It's also inspired, as we heard today, feminist foreign policy from nations around the world, beginning in Sweden in 2014, and now informally or formally by 20 other countries around the world, including Canada, and unfortunately, no longer Sweden. So we had a fascinating glimpse into feminist foreign policy and how that's reshaped Canadian foreign policy and the specific ways in which Canada has gone about implementing that. And then we've seen how the role women are playing and the ways in which feminist foreign policy is playing out in Ukraine, especially as we heard the role of women in Ukraine's military from the ambassador, as well as the role of unpaid care, humanitarian aid, support in the war effort, as well as warriors themselves. And I think I was struck in this conversation by the parallels between what Irena laid out for us and what's going on today in Ukraine, and what Chang outlined for us in Vietnam before the establishment of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. The same kinds of roles, those different roles that women played in the American conflict in Vietnam, as she noted. So there's a lot to celebrate in the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. As we said, it's approaching its 25th year, and the women and the feminist foreign policy agendas of Canada and elsewhere. But we also heard about how there's so much more still to be accomplished. And what I heard in the comments today, especially from Professor Nia Loin, was the tensions between the vision of the WPS and the practice of the WPS. That includes the consideration of all forms and ways in which women's security is impacted by conflict, not just gender-based violence, not just rape, right? But also things like obstetric care in Gaza, things like the care work burden that reverts post-war in the case of Vietnam to women, despite their high level of participation in peace negotiations. It also includes keeping an eye on that broad vision of security, right? Professor Nia Loin brought out the issue of counterterrorism, creating a new domain that's separate from that UN Security Council, in which the WPS agenda has a harder time reaching. I think about that through my own work in Latin America and the rise of gang violence that is threatening Mexico, that is threatening Ecuador, where Ecuador's president recently called for a state of emergency against the terrorism of gang violence. And women are very often caught over and over again in the violence by gangs on the one hand and by the state on the other. And this is another arena of security as we have this changing shapes of conflict from the more traditional types of conflict we see in Ukraine to the kind of proxy conflict that we saw in Vietnam, to internal conflicts of civil wars, to narco states. And gang violence that are becoming more prevalent in more countries around the world. And how can the WPS agenda continue to stay relevant in all different kinds of conflicts? So to summarize, we're looking at on just past International Women's Day, how much WPS represents a major advance in security policy, but how much more of its potential still has to be realized. And with that, we'll close it out.